The morning sun hit Sweetwater's main street like a judge's gavel, hard and unforgiving. November 1885 had come to Wyoming territory with the kind of cold that made men walk faster and women pull their shawls tighter. But Margaret Brennan stood perfectly still outside the general store, her worn boots planted in the dust, her breath making small clouds in the frozen air. She was a large woman, not in the way that apologized for itself, but in the way that spoke of hard work and harder years. Her hands were rough from washing other people's clothes. Her dress was clean but patched in 3 places, the fabric straining slightly across a belly that had grown rounder in recent months, though whether from grief eating or something else, the town had its theories. And her face, round and weathered at 32, carried the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too much for too long. Behind her, pressed against the storefront window, stood her children. Nathaniel, 8 years old, with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. Abigail, 5, clutching a corn-husk doll she'd made herself because there was no money for store-bought toys. They watched their mother's back stiffen as Victoria Ashford emerged from the store's shadows. Victoria Ashford was everything Sweetwater respected. 55 years old, dressed in black silk that cost more than most families earned in a year. Widow of the town's former banker, now owner of both the bank and the mercantile. Her face was sharp, her spine straighter, and her voice carried the weight of a woman who'd never heard the word no and didn't intend to start. "Mrs. Brennan?" Victoria's voice cut through the morning quiet like a knife through butter. "I'm afraid I cannot extend credit today." Maggie's hand tightened on the shopping list she'd spent an hour writing. Flour, salt, a bit of sugar if there was room in the budget. Basics. Necessities, the kind of things that kept children fed through a Wyoming winter. "I have money coming," Maggie said quietly, her free hand moving unconsciously to rest on her stomach before she caught herself and lowered it. "Mrs. Henderson owes me for washing, and you said that last week." Victoria's smile was thin and sharp. "And the week before. The Ladies' Society has been discussing your situation, Mrs. Brennan. A woman of your constitution should be more mindful of her circumstances." The word hung in the cold air. Constitution. It meant weight. It meant the way Maggie's dresses had gotten tighter over the summer and fall, the way she moved more carefully now, the way she seemed to grow larger even as her children grew thinner. It meant judgment. It meant all the small cruelties that respectable women wrapped in concern and delivered with a smile. 4 other women stood behind Victoria. Cordelia Holbrook, who'd never missed a chance to comment on someone else's failings. Martha Pine, who considered gossip a Christian duty. Ruth Brennan, Maggie's distant cousin, who looked at her shoes and said nothing. And Rosalind Ashford, Victoria's daughter, 25 and beautiful and silent as a painting. "A widow with 2 children," Victoria continued, her voice rising just enough to carry, "should consider her responsibilities. Perhaps if you showed more self-control at the dinner table, you might have better success managing your finances. Though I suppose we can all see where your priorities lie." Her eyes flickered meaningfully to Maggie's midsection. The words landed like stones thrown at glass, precise, deliberate, designed to crack something that was already fragile. Maggie felt Nate's small hand slip into hers, felt Abby press closer against her skirts, felt the weight of every eye on the street, turning toward her, measuring her, finding her wanting. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself against an accusation that wasn't entirely wrong, but wasn't what they thought either. But then Sheriff Tom Blackwood rounded the corner, his boots loud on the wooden sidewalk, a folded paper in his weathered hands. "Mrs. Brennan." His voice was gruff, but not unkind. He was a man who'd buried his own wife 2 winters back, who understood the particular flavor of grief that came with raising children alone. But the law was the law, and his job was his job. "I need a word." Maggie's heart dropped into her stomach, or rather, into the space where her stomach should have been if it weren't occupied by a secret she'd been keeping for nearly 7 months. The paper crackled as he unfolded it. An eviction notice, official, legal, stamped with the territorial seal. "You're 2 months past on the rent," he said quietly. "Mr. Dalton, who owns the property, he's been patient, but he's got bills of his own. Says you've got 7 days to settle accounts or vacate the premises." 7 days. The words echoed in Maggie's head like church bells at a funeral. 7 days to find $60. 7 days to keep a roof over her children's heads. 7 days before everything she'd been holding together with prayer and pride came apart in her hands. And 2 months, give or take, before the baby came and made hiding impossible. "There must be some mistake," she whispered, but her voice had no strength in it. There was no mistake. She knew it. The sheriff knew it. The whole damn town knew it. Victoria's smile widened just a fraction. Victory tasted sweet, even in the November cold. "Perhaps this is God's way of telling you to reconsider your pride, Mrs. Brennan. There are positions available. Housework, laundry. Even the boarding house needs help, though I'm not sure they'd want someone of your—" "That's enough." Ruth Brennan's voice was small but sharp. She stepped forward, her face flushed. "Victoria, this has gone far enough." Victoria turned her gaze on Ruth like a hawk spotting a field mouse. "Has it? I'm simply offering Christian guidance to a woman in need. You're offering cruelty dressed as concern, and everyone here knows it." The street went silent. In Sweetwater, you didn't contradict Victoria Ashford. Not if you wanted to keep your position in the ladies' society. Not if you wanted your husband to get fair treatment at the bank. But Ruth had said it anyway. Victoria's expression hardened into something cold and final. "I see. Perhaps you should reconsider your associations, Mrs. Brennan. Both of you." She turned on her heel, silk skirts whispering against the boardwalk. The other women followed like ducklings after their mother. All except Rosalind, who paused for just a moment, her eyes meeting Maggie's. There was something there. Sympathy, maybe. Or shame. Then she was gone, following her mother into the morning shadows. Maggie stood in the street, the eviction notice heavy as lead in her hands, her children pressed against her sides, and the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. The baby kicked inside her, a small flutter of movement that no one else could see or feel, a reminder that her time for hiding was running out. 7 days. She'd survived her husband's death 6 months ago, crushed in a mining accident that left her with 2 children, $15 in savings, and a pregnancy she'd only discovered a month after he was buried. She'd survived the whispers, the sideways glances, the way conversations stopped when she entered a room. She'd survived on washing and mending and the occasional pie she could sell for a few cents, all while her belly grew rounder and the baby inside her grew stronger. But 7 days? 7 days might finally break her. That night, the Brennan house was as cold inside as out. Maggie had let the fire burn low to save wood. They ate thin soup and stale bread for supper. The children asked no questions. They'd learned months ago that questions about why there wasn't more food or warmer blankets only made their mother's eyes sadder. After Nate and Abby were tucked into bed, sharing the same thin quilt for warmth, Maggie sat at the kitchen table and counted her money for the fourth time that day. $15.37. She'd counted it so many times she could feel the weight of each coin without looking. The worn silver dollars, the copper pennies, the single gold eagle that she'd been saving for true emergency. Against $60 in back rent, it was nothing. Against winter coming and children who needed food and a baby who'd need even more, it was worse than nothing. She pressed her palms against her eyes and let herself cry. Quietly, so the children wouldn't hear. The kind of crying that came from a place deeper than sadness, the place where fear lived. The baby moved again, a rolling sensation that would have delighted her under different circumstances. But now it just felt like one more burden, one more mouth to feed, one more secret that would soon be impossible to hide. The knock on the door came at 8:30. Maggie's head snapped up. No one visited after dark. Not her. Not anymore. She wiped her eyes quickly, smoothed her dress, the loose one that hid her condition best, and opened the door a crack. Thaddeus Garrett stood on her sagging porch, hat in his hands, the November wind pulling at his coat. He was a tall man, built like the cottonwoods that grew along the creek, solid and weathered and silent. 45 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting at distant horizons. He owned the Diamond G Ranch, 2,400 acres stretching from the Snake River to the foothills, 800 head of cattle, 40 horses, the kind of wealth that made him one of the most powerful men in the territory. And for 5 years, since the day his wife Catherine died of scarlet fever, he'd been one of the loneliest. "Mr. Garrett," Maggie's voice was hoarse from crying. "It's late." "Yes, ma'am." His voice was deep and rough, like stones tumbling in a river. "I apologize for the hour, but I heard about your situation, and I need to speak with you." She hesitated. The whole town would be talking if Thaddeus Garrett was seen at her door after dark. But then again, the whole town was already talking. What did it matter now? She opened the door wider, holding her shawl carefully around her shoulders to disguise the shape beneath. He stepped inside, and the small house seemed to shrink around him. Not because he was overly large, but because he carried the kind of presence that filled a room. The scent of horse and leather and wood smoke came with him. He stood in her kitchen, looking at her worn table, her cold stove, her carefully mended curtains. His eyes missed nothing. The patch in her dress, the shadows under her eyes, the way her hands trembled just slightly as she gestured to a chair, the careful way she positioned herself so the lamplight wouldn't silhouette her condition. "Would you like coffee?" she asked, knowing she had none. "No, ma'am, thank you." They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Then Thad reached into his coat and pulled out something that made Maggie's breath catch. A leather pouch, old and worn, the kind a man carried close to his body for years, the kind that held things that mattered. He set it on the table between them with a soft thud that spoke of weight, of substance. $340, he said quietly. "I've been saving it for 5 years. Meant to buy the Henderson property, expand the ranch. But I'm thinking maybe I'll put it to better use." Maggie stared at the pouch like it was a snake that might bite. "I don't understand." "Your rent's $60. That leaves you $280 for getting through winter. Food, firewood, whatever you need." "Mr. Garrett, I can't." "It's not charity." His voice was firm, but not harsh. "I'm offering you a job. My housekeeper quit last month, went to live with her daughter in Cheyenne. I need someone who can cook and keep house. $30 a month, plus room and board for you and your children. The foreman's cottage is empty. 3 rooms, good stove, close to the main house. Maggie's hands gripped the edge of the table. Her mind raced. A job. A real job. Safety for her children. And maybe, just maybe, a place to have this baby where she wouldn't be thrown out on the street for the shame of it. But there had to be more to it than that. Why? It was the only question that mattered. Why would one of the richest men in the territory offer his life savings to a woman the town had already written off? Why would he give her a job when he could hire any of a dozen respectable widows who'd jump at the chance? Thad was quiet for a long moment. His calloused hands turned his hat slowly, around and around, like a man searching for words he'd never learned to speak. 5 years ago, he finally said, there was a church social. My wife had been dead about a month. I was there because folks expected it, not because I wanted to be. And I saw you at the food table. Your husband was still alive then. You'd brought an Irish stew and folks were lined up 3 deep to get some. He paused, his eyes distant with memory. I took a bowl, just to be polite. But when I tasted it, his voice roughened. It was exactly like what my mother used to make. She was from County Cork, came over when she was 16. She died when I was young, but I never forgot that stew. The way it tasted, like home and comfort and love all mixed together. Maggie's eyes were wide. She remembered that day. Remembered the tall rancher taking a bowl and eating in silence. Remembered thinking he looked like a man who'd forgotten what joy tasted like. Remembered that she'd been 4 months pregnant with Abby then, tired and swollen-ankled, but happy because her husband was still sober and her children were fed. I asked you about the recipe, Thad continued. You said your mother was Irish too, from Galway, that she'd taught you to cook the old way, with feeling instead of measurements. I remember, Maggie whispered. After that, I noticed you. At church, in town, the way you carried yourself with dignity, even when folks treated you like you were invisible. The way you raised your children to be polite, even when other children were cruel. The way you never asked for help, even when it was clear you needed it. He met her eyes fully for the first time. When your husband died, I thought about offering help then. But I knew how it would look. A widower, barely a year out from his own grief, approaching a new widow. The gossip would have destroyed you. So I waited. Told myself I'd wait for the right moment. And tonight's the right moment? There was no accusation in her voice, just exhaustion and a faint, dangerous thread of hope. Tonight's the only moment left before you lose your home. Thad pushed the leather pouch closer to her. Take the money, pay your rent. Then tomorrow, you pack up your children and your things, and you come to the Diamond G. You work for me. Honest work for honest pay. You pay me back the $340 by having it taken from your wages, $10 a month. Call it an advance if it makes you feel better. The whole town will talk. The whole town's already talking. His voice was gentle but firm. Let them. I need a housekeeper who can cook. You need a job and a safe place for your children. Everything else is just noise. Maggie looked at the leather pouch, at this man who'd carried his savings for 5 years, waiting for the right moment to expand his ranch, and who is now offering it all to her without hesitation. Her hand moved unconsciously to her belly. Soon, very soon, everyone would know. And then what? Would he withdraw the offer? Would he feel deceived? Why, really? she asked again. "Please, I need to know the truth." Thad was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because for 5 years, I've watched you be invisible to people who should have seen you. Because I know what it feels like to be alone in a crowd. Because my mother taught me that when you can help someone, you do it. No questions asked." He paused. "And because that Irish stew tasted like every good memory I had of being a child. And I thought any woman who could cook like that deserved better than to be thrown out on the street for the crime of existing." The truth settled between them like snow falling on winter ground, quiet, soft, covering everything in white. Maggie reached out with shaking hands and picked up the leather pouch. It was heavy with hope and terrifying with obligation. Inside were 5 years of a man's savings, 5 years of work and sacrifice and patience. "I'll pay you back," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Every cent, even if it takes years." "I know you will," Thad said simply. He stood, settling his hat back on his head. "I'll send my foreman, Finn O'Malley, by tomorrow morning with a wagon. He'll help you move your things. Be ready by 9. He moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing, Mrs. Brennan. I have 8 ranch hands. They eat breakfast at 6 and supper at 6. They're good men, but they've been living on beans and bacon for a month. If you could see your way to making that Irish stew sometime soon, I expect you'd have 8 men willing to defend you against anyone who says an unkind word." The ghost of a smile touched his weathered face, including Victoria Ashford. Then he was gone, stepping out into the November night, leaving Maggie standing in her cold kitchen with a leather pouch full of hope and the first real chance she'd had in months. She sank into her chair and let the tears come again. But this time, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of the terrifying, exhilarating feeling that maybe, just maybe, she and her children, all 3 of them, were going to survive this after all. In the bedroom, Nate lay awake, having heard everything. He pressed his face into the thin pillow and whispered a prayer of thanks to a God he'd stopped believing in when his father died. Tomorrow, they were going to the Diamond G Ranch. Tomorrow, everything was going to change. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Maggie woke her children before sunrise and told them to pack their things. They owned so little it took less than an hour. Clothes worn thin from washing. A few treasured toys. The quilt Maggie's mother had made before she died. The family Bible with all their names written inside. At 9 o'clock exactly, a wagon pulled up outside their house. Finnegan O'Malley was a man of 50 with a weathered Irish face and eyes that crinkled at the corners from years of squinting at the sun. He'd worked for Thad Garrett for 15 years, ever since he'd arrived in Wyoming Territory, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a reputation for being able to gentle even the wildest horse. "Mrs. Brennan," he tipped his hat, his brogue thick as morning fog. "I'm Finn. Boss sent me to help with the moving." He said it matter-of-factly, as if there was nothing unusual about one of the territory's richest ranchers sending his foreman to help a destitute widow move her meager possessions. Maggie had spent the early morning hours doing one thing before they left. She'd taken the leather pouch to Mr. Dalton's house and paid her rent in full. 2 months back, plus 2 months forward. The look on his face when she'd counted out the bills had been worth every cent. Now, as she watched Finn and Nate load their few boxes into the wagon, she felt Ruth appear at her elbow. Her cousin's face was worried. "Are you sure about this, Maggie? Moving out to the Garrett Ranch? The talk's already started. Victoria's telling everyone you've sold yourself to—" I've sold myself to no one." Maggie's voice was firm, one hand resting protectively on her middle. "I've accepted honest work. There's a difference." "Is there? In Sweetwater?" Maggie turned to face her cousin fully. Ruth had been kind when kindness was rare. She deserved honesty. "In 6 months, I've buried my husband, raised 2 children alone, and watched this town decide I wasn't worth their compassion. I've scraped and struggled and begged for work, and all I got was judgment wrapped in pity." She gestured to the wagon. "Mr. Garrett offered me a real job, with real pay, and a safe place for my children. If the town wants to make something ugly out of that, that's their sin, not mine." Ruth hugged her quickly, fiercely. "God go with you then. And Maggie, for what it's worth, I think you're the bravest woman I know." Then she was gone, hurrying back to her own house before anyone saw her associating with the town's newest scandal. The ride to the Diamond G took an hour. The ranch was 7 miles outside Sweetwater, tucked into a valley where the Snake River bent like a silver ribbon through the brown grass. The main house was 2 stories of solid timber, built to last through Wyoming's brutal winters. Barns and outbuildings clustered around it like chicks around a hen. And everywhere there were men working, mending fences, breaking horses, moving cattle from one pasture to another. Hard men doing hard work in hard country. They stared as the wagon rolled past, a woman and 2 children being brought to the boss's ranch. The gossip would have reached them by now, Maggie knew. She lifted her chin and stared straight ahead, her shawl pulled carefully around her expanding middle. Finn pulled the wagon to a stop in front of a small cottage set apart from the main house. It was simple but well built, with glass windows and a stone chimney already sending up a thin trail of smoke. "Boss had me fire up the stove this morning," Finn said, helping Abby down from the wagon with surprising gentleness for such rough hands. "Wanted it warm for when you arrived." Inside, the cottage was modest but clean. A main room with a good stove and a table. 2 bedrooms off to the side. Wooden floors that had been freshly swept. Curtains on the windows that someone had clearly hung that very morning. It was the nicest place Maggie had lived in since her husband died. "The main house is just there," Finn pointed through the window. "Boss takes his meals alone at 7 in the evening. Ranch hands eat in the cookhouse at 6 morning and night. You'll have help with the heavy work. Gideon does the wood chopping. Caleb handles the water hauling. Your job's the cooking and the cleaning of the main house." He paused, his weathered face serious. "Boss is a good man, Mrs. Brennan. Fair, honest. But he's private. Lost his wife 5 years back, and it changed him, made him quiet. He won't bother you none, and he won't tolerate anyone else bothering you either. You do your work, he'll do right by you." Maggie nodded, her throat too tight for words. After Finn left, she stood in her new home and let herself breathe. Really breathe, for the first time in months. No sheriff's notice on the door. No landlord demanding payment. No Victoria Ashford's judgment poisoning the air. Just a warm stove and clean floors and the possibility of a future. A place where she could have this baby without being thrown into the street. A place where her children could eat and sleep warm and maybe, just maybe, have a childhood that wasn't defined by poverty and shame. Nate appeared at her side. "Mama, is this really ours?" "For now, baby, as long as we work hard and do right." "I can work hard." His young face was solemn, so much older than 8 years should look. "Mr. Finn said I could help with the horses if you say it's okay." "We'll see." She touched his dark hair gently. "First, let's get settled. Then I need to cook supper for 9 hungry men." That evening, Maggie stood in Thaddeus Garrett's kitchen and took stock. It was a good kitchen. Professional. The kind a wealthy rancher would build for a wife he'd loved. Copper pots hanging from hooks. A massive cast-iron stove. A larder stocked with basics, but lacking the touch of someone who cooked with love instead of duty. She found beef, potatoes, carrots, onions. The ingredients for a simple stew, but she could make it special, could make it taste like home. As she worked, her hands moving through the familiar motions of chopping and stirring, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Purpose. She moved carefully around the kitchen, one hand occasionally bracing against the table when the baby kicked with particular enthusiasm. Nearly 7 months now. Soon it would be impossible to hide, even with the apron and the loose dress and the way she angled her body when people looked at her. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, she had work to do. Had a promise to keep to a man who'd saved her and her children without asking anything in return except honest labor. At 6 o'clock exactly, 8 men filed into the cookhouse. They were rough men, scarred by work and weather, ranging from Finn's 50 years down to young Tobias, who couldn't be more than 26. They sat at the long table and waited, their faces carefully neutral. Maggie served them herself, ladled the stew into bowls, set down fresh bread she'd baked that afternoon, poured coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Then she stepped back and waited. The first spoonful brought silence. Then Silas Granger, a man of 42, who looked like he'd been carved from granite, closed his eyes and made a sound suspiciously like a prayer. "Lord Almighty," he breathed. "That's food." Ezra Thornton nodded agreement, his normally stoic face softening. Jasper McBride, who had the rolling accent of the Scottish Highlands, looked up at Maggie with something like reverence. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I've not tasted cooking like this since my mother died 20 years ago." One by one, the ranch hands thanked her, quietly, respectfully, like men who understood that good food was a kind of love, and love had been absent from the Diamond G for far too long. At 7 o'clock, Maggie carried a plate to the main house. Her hands shook slightly as she knocked on the door. "Come." She entered to find Thaddeus Garrett sitting at a dining table built for 12 but set for 1. The room was clean but cold, functional, the kind of space a man occupied but didn't live in. She set the plate before him without a word. Irish stew, fresh bread, coffee. Then she turned to leave. "Mrs. Brennan." She paused. "Thank you for coming. I hope the cottage suits you and your children." "It does, Mr. Garrett. Thank you." She was almost to the door when he spoke again. "That stew. It's exactly like I remembered." Maggie turned back. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the plate before him. But there was something in his face, a softening, a crack in the careful walls he'd built around himself. "My mother used to say food is how we show love when words are too hard," she said quietly. His eyes lifted to hers, gray as a winter sky, deep with old pain and older loneliness. "Your mother was a wise woman." She was. They stood in that moment of understanding, two people who'd both lost too much and learned to carry on anyway. Then Maggie left him to his meal and walked back through the November darkness to her cottage, where her children waited. Behind her, in the big, empty house, Thaddeus Garrett ate slowly, carefully, like a man savoring something he'd thought was lost forever. And for the first time in 5 years, the Diamond G Ranch felt a little less like a monument to the dead and a little more like a home for the living. 3 weeks passed like water flowing over stones, slowly at first, then gathering momentum, reshaping everything in its path. Maggie rose each morning before dawn, the way she'd done all her life. But now she rose in a warm cottage with a good stove and children who slept soundly instead of shivering under thin blankets. She crossed the yard to the main house, while stars still burned cold and bright overhead, moving more carefully now as her belly grew heavier with each passing day. 7 months along now, nearly 8. The baby would come in January if her calculations were right. Maybe early February. She'd stopped trying to hide it from herself, though she still hid it from everyone else. Loose aprons over looser dresses, shawls even when the kitchen grew warm. Strategic positioning when she served food, always turning her side to the men rather than her front. The ranch had its own rhythm, ancient and unchanging as the seasons. The hands rose at 5:30, their boots loud on the bunkhouse floor. By 6, they were in the cookhouse, waiting for breakfast with the patience of men who knew good food was worth the wait. Maggie fed them eggs and bacon and biscuits that melted on the tongue. Hot coffee strong enough to fight off the November cold. And every morning, Silas Granger would nod his grizzled head and say the same thing. "Fine cooking, ma'am. Just fine." The other men would echo his thanks, their rough voices gentle in the pre-dawn darkness. They never mentioned the way she moved more slowly now, or the way her dresses seemed to strain despite their generous cut. Ranchmen knew how to mind their own business. Then they'd head out to their work, and Maggie would clean the cookhouse and turn her attention to the main house. Thaddeus Garrett's home was a strange place, large and well-built, but hollow somehow, as if the walls remembered laughter and warmth, but had forgotten how to hold them. The furniture was good quality, but worn. The curtains were practical, but colorless. And everywhere, in small ways, there was evidence of a woman who died 5 years ago and left nothing behind but absence. Maggie moved through the rooms carefully at first, one hand on the furniture to steady herself when the baby kicked particularly hard, dusting, sweeping, changing the linens. But gradually, almost without meaning to, she began to add small touches. A jar of dried wildflowers on the kitchen table. Curtains she'd mended and rehung so they caught the light better. The scent of bread baking instead of just beans heating. She never moved Catherine Garrett's things. The photograph on the mantel stayed exactly where it was. A pretty woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. A woman who died too young, leaving a husband alone in a house too big for one. Maggie respected that ghost, honored it even. But she also began, slowly and carefully, to make the house feel lived in again. Nate thrived in ways that broke Maggie's heart with joy. The boy had been quiet for months after his father died, withdrawn and careful, as if afraid that showing happiness might be a betrayal. But here, with work to do and men who treated him with rough kindness, he began to bloom. Finn O'Malley took him under his wing like a grandfather with a favorite grandson. Taught him to curry horses properly, to check hooves for stones, to read the weather in the way clouds gathered over the mountains. Nate absorbed it all with the desperate hunger of a boy who had been starving for a father's attention. "He's got the touch," Finn told Maggie one evening, his Irish brogue thick with approval. "Horses know when someone fears them and when someone respects them. Your boy respects them. He'll make a fine horseman someday." And Abby, small and serious at 5 years old, had found her own place in the ranch's daily rhythm. She collected eggs from the henhouse each morning, counting them carefully and reporting the total to her mother with grave importance. She'd named all 12 chickens, much to the amusement of the ranch hands. It was Thad who'd started that. Maggie had watched from the kitchen window one afternoon as the tall rancher knelt beside her daughter in the chicken yard. His deep voice carried on the cold air, patient and gentle. "That one there, with the red feathers? She's the boss of the whole flock. You should give her a boss's name." Abby had considered this seriously, her small face scrunched in concentration. "Queen Victoria?" Thad's laugh had been rusty, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. Perfect. Watching her children find their footing in this new life, Maggie felt something she'd thought was dead. Hope. The dangerous, fragile kind that made you believe tomorrow might be better than today. But it was the evenings that changed everything. Maggie served Thad his supper at 7 o'clock each night. She'd learned his preferences quickly. He liked his coffee black and his meat cooked through. He ate slowly, deliberately, like a man who'd spent too many years eating alone and had forgotten that meals could be social occasions. For the first week, she'd simply set his plate before him and left, moving carefully so he wouldn't notice the increasing roundness of her middle. He'd thank her quietly, and that would be the extent of their interaction. But then, one evening in the third week, she'd served him pot roast with carrots and potatoes, and he'd paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. "My mother made this," he'd said, his voice rough with memory. "Same way, with the rosemary and the thyme," Maggie had finished, one hand unconsciously resting on her belly, as the baby gave a particularly vigorous kick. She moved the hand quickly, but not before she saw his eyes flicker downward, then quickly away. Just a touch, too much overpowers the beef. Their eyes had met. Something passed between them. Not attraction, exactly. More like recognition. Two people who'd both lost their mothers young and carried those losses like stones in their pockets. And perhaps, though neither said it, recognition of another kind, the kind that saw what others missed. After that, he'd started talking, just a little, a comment about the meal, a question about the children, nothing deep, nothing that crossed the careful line they both knew existed. But it was something. The breakthrough came on a cold Tuesday evening, nearly 4 weeks after Maggie's arrival. She'd found potatoes and cabbage in the larder, and an idea had struck her. Cole cannon, her mother's recipe, passed down from her grandmother in County Galway. Mashed potatoes with cabbage and butter and cream, simple but perfect. The kind of food that tasted like home and safety and a mother's love all mixed together. She'd made it without thinking, her hands working from memory, while the baby shifted and turned inside her, making her pause occasionally to catch her breath. Nearly 8 months now. Not much longer. When she set the bowl before Thad that evening, his reaction was immediate and visceral. His hand froze on his fork. His eyes went to the food, then to her face, then back to the food. "How did you?" His voice cracked. "No one knows this recipe. My mother never wrote it down." "I didn't know it was your mother's recipe," Maggie said honestly, settling into the chair across from him with relief. The baby was pressing on something that made standing uncomfortable tonight. "It's mine, my mother's, from Ireland." Thad took a bite, chewed slowly, closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "It's exact," he whispered. "Every detail. The way the cabbage is chopped, the amount of butter, even the He paused, his throat working. Even the love. That's what she used to say. The secret ingredient is love. My mother said the same thing. Maggie's hand moved to her belly again, unable to help herself. The baby was active tonight, as if responding to the emotion in the room. This time, Thad's eyes followed the movement, held there for a long moment, then lifted to her face with a question he didn't voice. Maggie felt her cheeks flush. The secret was out, at least with him. But there was no judgment in his eyes, just quiet understanding. "Tell me about her," she said softly, neither confirming nor denying what he'd surely guessed. "Your mother." And Thad did. His mother's name had been Mary Catherine O'Brien, from Cork, not Galway, but close enough. She'd come to America at 16, married a rancher's son at 18, died of pneumonia when Thad was 16. She taught him to read and write and do sums. She taught him to see beauty in hard country. And she'd taught him that a man's worth was measured in how he treated people who couldn't help him. She used to sing while she cooked, Thad said, his voice soft with memory. Irish songs I didn't understand but loved anyway. And she'd tell me stories about the old country, about green hills and stone walls and rain that fell soft instead of hard. My mother told those same stories, Maggie said, both hands resting on her belly now, no longer trying to hide. I think all Irish mothers do, passing on a homeland their children will never see. Do you ever wish you could see it? Ireland? Sometimes, but then I think about how my mother left everything she knew to come here, how brave that was. And I think maybe the real Ireland isn't a place. It's the recipes and the stories and the way we carry our people with us, even after they're gone. Thad's eyes held hers across the table. In the lamplight, she could see the lines around them, the silver in his hair, the scars on his hands from years of hard work. He was not a young man, but there was something in his face in that moment that looked almost young, almost hopeful. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "Something I should have said when I first brought you here." Maggie's heart beat faster. "What?" "That day at the church social, 5 years ago, when I tasted your stew and it reminded me of my mother." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It wasn't just the food. It was you. The way you moved through that crowd like you didn't see the judgment in their eyes. The way you smiled at your husband, even though everyone knew he drank too much and treated you poorly. The way you loved your children with a fierceness that made me remember what love looked like." "Mr. Garrett." "After that day, I started noticing you. At church, in town. I'd see you with your shopping basket, counting pennies. See you mending clothes that should have been thrown away years ago. See you holding your head high, even when the Ladies' Society pretended you didn't exist." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "And for 5 years, I went to church every Sunday, not because I believed in much anymore, but because I knew you'd be there, in the fellowship hall, cooking for the socials, and for 1 hour a week, I could pretend I was eating my mother's food again, could pretend someone in this world still cared about putting love into simple things." The confession hung between them, like something precious and fragile. "You never spoke to me," Maggie whispered. "No, because I knew how it would look. A wealthy widower paying attention to a married woman? The scandal would have destroyed you. So I just watched and waited and told myself maybe someday, when enough time had passed, I'd find the courage to speak to you properly. And then my husband died. And then your husband died, and I knew I had to wait even longer. 6 months of mourning. A year, maybe. However long it took for the town to stop watching you like vultures waiting for a meal. His hands clenched on the table. But then I heard about the eviction notice, and I knew I couldn't wait anymore. Not if it meant you'd lose everything. Maggie felt tears burning in her eyes. You gave me your savings. 5 years of savings. For a woman you barely knew. I knew you, Thad said simply. Maybe not the facts of your life, but I knew your character. Knew it from 5 years of watching you be kind when you had every reason to be bitter. Brave when you had every reason to give up. Dignified when everyone else had decided you weren't worth their dignity. He stood abruptly, as if the intimacy of the moment had become too much to bear. I shouldn't have said all that. I apologize. You work for me, and I shouldn't make you uncomfortable with... You didn't. Maggie stood too, slower, her hand bracing on the table. The movement made her condition unmistakable. Make me uncomfortable. I'm just trying to understand why a man would do what you did. And I think maybe I'm starting to. Their eyes held. The moment stretched. Then Thad's gaze dropped to her belly, then quickly back to her face. How far along? The question was gentle, non-judgmental, just curiosity from someone who'd guessed the truth. Nearly 8 months. The baby was my husband's, conceived just before he died. I didn't even know until after the funeral. And you've been hiding it all this time. What choice did I have? An unwed mother, even a widow, carrying a child? The town would have... She trailed off. The town would have made it even harder than they already did. Thad's jaw tightened. You should have told me, when I offered you the job. Would you have still hired me if you'd known? Yes, no hesitation. But I would have made sure you had access to Doc Harrison. Made sure you weren't working too hard. Made sure... He stopped, running a hand through his hair. You're due in about a month then. 6 weeks, maybe. Early February, if my calculations are right. Thad nodded slowly. We'll need to prepare. Get Doc Harrison out here before the baby comes. Make sure... Mr. Garrett, you don't have to... Yes, I do. His voice was firm. You work for me. That means I'm responsible for your welfare. All of it. Including making sure you and that baby are safe. He stepped back, putting proper distance between them again. Thank you for supper, Mrs. Brennan. The Colcannon was... It was perfect. After she left, Thad sat alone in his dining room and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He'd said too much, revealed too much, crossed lines that a gentleman never crossed with a woman in his employ. But God help him, it had felt good to finally speak the truth. And now that he knew about the baby, now that he understood the full weight of what she'd been carrying alone, he felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. He'd saved her from eviction, but he hadn't saved her from everything she was facing. Not yet. In her cottage, Maggie tucked her children into bed and tried to make sense of what had just happened. A man had loved her from afar for 5 years. Not for her beauty, which she knew she didn't possess. Not for status or connections or anything she could offer him. Just because she'd cooked with love and carried herself with dignity. And he knew about the baby now. Knew her secret. But instead of judgment or withdrawal, he'd offered protection, responsibility, care. It was the strangest, most wonderful thing anyone had ever told her. And it terrified her. Because she was beginning to understand that what she felt for Thaddeus Garrett wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper. Something that could destroy her if she let it. The next Sunday, Maggie made a decision that had been weighing on her for weeks. she would go to church. Not to cower in the back pew, but to hold her head high and show Sweetwater that she had nothing to be ashamed of. She dressed carefully in her best dress, the dark blue one, with enough room in the bodice to accommodate her expanding middle. She braided Abby's hair and made sure Nate's collar was straight. Then they walked the 7 miles to town, Maggie moving slowly now, one hand pressed to the small of her back, where the weight of the baby made her ache. The congregation turned as one when she entered. Whispers rippled through the pews like wind through grass. Maggie felt every eye on her, measuring her, judging the unmistakable swell of her belly beneath the dark fabric. She led her children to a pew near the back and sat down, spine straight, eyes forward, hands folded over the life growing inside her. Father Brennan Walsh, 60 years old, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that missed nothing, smiled from the pulpit. "Welcome, all who have come to worship this morning." But before the service could begin, Victoria Ashford stood up. She was dressed in black silk, as always. Her face was sharp with righteous indignation, and her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of a woman accustomed to being obeyed. "Father Walsh, I must protest. This woman," she pointed at Maggie like one might point at a snake in the grass, "is living in sin with Thaddeus Garrett. She parades her shame before God and this congregation. She has no place in the house of the Lord." The church went silent. Maggie felt Nate's small hand slip into hers, felt Abby press closer, felt the baby kick inside her as if protesting the accusation on her behalf. Father Walsh's expression didn't change. "Mrs. Ashford, please sit down." "I will not. The Ladies' Society has discussed this matter thoroughly. Margaret Brennan is a disgrace to Christian womanhood." She flaunts her condition, living under the same roof as an unmarried man, bearing a child conceived in— "Enough!" The priest's voice cracked like a whip. "You will sit down, Victoria, or you will leave this church. Those are your choices." Victoria's face flushed red. "You cannot speak to me that way. My late husband was a pillar of this community. My family has donated—" "Your family's donations do not buy you the right to judge your neighbors." Father Walsh stepped down from the pulpit, his weathered face stern. "Margaret Brennan is a widow who has accepted honest employment. She cooks and cleans for Mr. Garrett and his ranch hands. She lives in the foreman's cottage with her children. That is work, not sin. Everyone can see her condition. A child conceived out of wedlock? A child conceived in her marriage to her late husband." Doc Harrison stood up from where he'd been sitting 3 rows back. "I have medical records proving Mrs. Brennan was approximately 7 months pregnant when her husband died in May. The baby was conceived in March while she was still married. It's expected in late January or early February." His voice was steady, professional. "Unless you're accusing a widow of adultery while her husband was alive, Mrs. Ashford, I suggest you choose your words more carefully." Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She hid the pregnancy. That itself speaks to a woman trying to survive in a town that judges her for existing. Father Walsh's Irish brogue grew thicker with anger. "I've known Margaret since she was a child. I married her to her husband. I buried him 6 months ago. And I've watched this congregation turn its back on a woman who needed Christian charity, not Christian judgment." He turned to face the full congregation. "Margaret Brennan is welcome in this church, as are her children. Anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to discuss it with me privately. After the service, in my office, where gossip belongs." Victoria's mouth pressed into a thin, furious line. Then she gathered her skirts and swept out of the church, her daughter Rosalind trailing behind her. Half the ladies' society followed. The other half stayed, their faces troubled but uncertain. Father Walsh returned to the pulpit. "Now, shall we worship, or shall we spend the morning in judgment? Because I'm fairly certain the Lord has opinions about which of those he prefers." The service proceeded. Maggie sat through it with tears streaming silently down her face, Nate on one side and Abby on the other, and felt something she hadn't felt in months: protected. After the service, Ruth caught her on the church steps, taking in the unmistakable evidence of Maggie's condition with wide eyes. Maggie, how far along are you?" 8 months, nearly. The baby's due in about 6 weeks. "And you've been working? Hiding it?" "What choice did I have?" Maggie's hand moved protectively over her belly. "I needed the job. Needed to keep my children safe. If I'd told anyone, they would have made it harder." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "I should have seen it. Should have known. You've always been a large woman, but I should have—" She hugged Maggie carefully, mindful of the baby between them. "You're so brave. Braver than I could ever be." "I'm not brave. I'm desperate. There's a difference." "No." Ruth pulled back, her hands on Maggie's shoulders. "You're brave, and you should be prepared. Victoria's not the kind of woman who takes public embarrassment well. She'll retaliate. She always does. Let her. I have nothing left to hide now." But Maggie was wrong about that. She had everything to lose. The retaliation came faster than anyone expected. 3 days after the church confrontation, a rider arrived at the Diamond G Ranch with an official notice. Finn brought it to Maggie while she was kneading bread in the main house kitchen, her movements slower now, her back aching from the weight she carried. "This came from town. It's got the territorial seal on it. Legal business." Maggie's hands stilled in the dough. With shaking fingers, leaving flour prints on the envelope, she took it and broke the seal. The words swam before her eyes, legal terminology she barely understood, but certain phrases stood out, sharp as knives. Petition for emergency custody, unfit living environment, moral turpitude. Margaret Brennan, widow, currently residing in unwed cohabitation. Impending birth out of wedlock. Her knees buckled. She caught herself on the table, flour dusting her dark dress like snow. Victoria Ashford, acting as provisional representative of the Ladies' Society for Child Welfare, a title that apparently gave her legal authority, was petitioning the territorial court for emergency custody of Nathaniel and Abigail Brennan. The grounds were simple and devastating. Maggie was living in an inappropriate arrangement with an unmarried man. The children were being raised in an environment that was morally questionable and potentially harmful. And as a woman about to bear a child conceived in adultery or out of wedlock, despite Doc Harrison's testimony, Maggie was demonstrating a lack of moral character that called into question her ability to properly raise children. The hearing was scheduled for 10 days from now, December 15th, before the baby came, while Maggie was still heavily pregnant and vulnerable. "No." The word came out as a whisper, then louder. "No, she can't. They're my children. She can't take my children." Finn stood helpless, his rough hands twisting his hat. "I'll get the boss." Fad arrived within minutes, his face dark with fury as he read the notice. Behind him came Doc Harrison, who'd been at the ranch checking on a hand who'd injured his shoulder. "This is insane," Fad said, his voice low and dangerous. "She can't do this." "She can try," Doc Harrison said grimly. Victoria Ashford's late husband was the town magistrate. She still has influence with Judge Blackwood. And technically, there's precedent for removing children from what the court deems morally corrupting environments. Maggie works for me, that's all. Honest work. You and I know that. But Victoria's made it sound like something else entirely. And in court, perception often matters more than truth. The doctor's face was grave, especially with a woman who's visibly pregnant and unmarried. Maggie sank into a chair, the notice clutched in her trembling hands, flour still dusting her fingers. "She's going to win, isn't she? She's going to take my babies." The men exchanged glances. No one wanted to say it, but the silence spoke volumes. That evening, as dark settled over the ranch like a suffocating blanket, there was a soft knock on Maggie's cottage door. She opened it to find Rosalind Ashford standing in the December cold, her beautiful face pale and frightened, her breath making small clouds in the frozen air. "Mrs. Brennan, I need to speak with you. Quickly, before anyone sees me." Maggie let her in, more from shock than hospitality. Victoria's daughter, here? It made no sense. Rosalind stood in the small parlor, her fine dress incongruous against the simple furniture. Her hands twisted together nervously. "I came to warn you. My mother, she's not going to stop. She's determined to win this custody case. She's already spoken with Judge Blackwood privately. They're old friends. She's convinced him that you're a danger to your children's moral development." "Why?" Maggie's voice broke, one hand resting on her swollen belly. "Why does she hate me so much?" Rosalind's laugh was bitter. "Because you refused to be destroyed. Because when she expected you to disappear, you survived. And because—" She paused, her face flushing. "Because Mr. Garrett looks at you the way he's never looked at me, despite my mother pushing us together for 5 years. The truth of it hung in the air. "I don't want your children taken from you," Rosalind continued quietly. "I don't want to be part of my mother's cruelty anymore. But I'm not strong enough to stand against her publicly. So I came to tell you this. She's going to win. Judge Blackwood owes her too many favors. Unless you have something that changes the fundamental nature of the case, you're going to lose your children in 10 days. After she left, Maggie sat in the darkness and wept. Not the quiet crying she'd learned to do so her children wouldn't hear, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from the place where terror lived. She was going to lose Nate and Abby, all because she had accepted honest work from a good man. All because Victoria Ashford's pride couldn't tolerate being defied. The baby moved inside her, a rolling sensation that would have delighted her under different circumstances. But now it just felt like one more burden, one more complication. In 6 weeks, she'd give birth to this child. But if Victoria won, she'd give birth alone, without the other children she'd fought so hard to protect. The thought was unbearable. The storm came 2 days later, on December 10th, 5 days before the custody hearing. Wyoming weather was unpredictable in December, but this was exceptional even by territorial standards. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 4 hours. Clouds rolled in from the north, heavy and dark as bruises. And by noon, snow was falling so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. "Early season blizzard," Finn said grimly, securing the barn doors. "Could last 3 days. Everyone needs to stay inside." By 2 o'clock, the ranch hands were all accounted for. All except young Tobias, who'd ridden out that morning to check on cattle in the north pasture, and Nate, who'd gone to help him. Maggie's scream brought every man running. "Where's my son? Where's Nathaniel?" Finn's face went white. He said he wanted to learn about winter pasture checks. Tobias took 'em along this morning before the storm came in. They were supposed to be back by noon. They should have been back by now. I know. Thad was already saddling Midnight, his black stallion. The horse was 17 hands of muscle and intelligence, bred for Wyoming winters. I'm going after them. You'll freeze to death, Doc Harrison protested. It's 20 below with the wind chill. Then I'll freeze, but I'm not leaving that boy out there. Thad's face was set in lines of absolute determination. Finn was already saddling his own horse. I'm coming with you. 3 other hands, Caleb, Silas, and Ezra, volunteered immediately. Maggie wanted to go too, but Thad's hand on her shoulder stopped her. Stay here. Keep Abby safe, and— his eyes dropped to her swollen belly. Keep yourself safe. If we don't come back, take her to Father Walsh. He'll protect you both from Victoria. Then he was gone, riding into a storm that had already killed men better prepared than they were. Maggie stood at the window and watched them disappear into the white chaos, her heart in her throat and her prayers on her lips, one hand pressed to her belly, where the baby kicked and turned, restless. And deep inside her, something else began. A tightening, a cramping that had nothing to do with the baby's movements. Not now, she thought desperately. Please, God, not now. But her body had other plans. The storm raged on, indifferent to human suffering. And somewhere in the frozen darkness, her 8-year-old son was fighting for his life. While inside her, too early and too soon, another life was demanding to be born. The wind howled like something alive and angry, tearing at Thaddeus Garrett's coat, as Midnight plunged through snow that was already knee-deep on the horse. Visibility was less than 5 feet. The world had become nothing but white chaos and killing cold. "Nate!" His voice was torn away by the wind before it could carry more than a few yards. "Tobias!" Beside him, Finn hunched low over his mount's neck, squinting against the driving snow. They'd have headed for the line shack near Copper Creek. It's the only shelter in the north pasture. If they'd made it that far, if they hadn't gotten turned around in the whiteout, if they weren't already frozen in some gully, buried under snow that fell faster than any man could dig. Thad pushed the thought away and urged Midnight forward. The stallion was smart, bred for this country, with instincts that had saved Thad's life more than once. He gave the horse his head and trusted him to find the way. 2 hours into the search, when Thad's face was so numb he couldn't feel it anymore, and his hands were cramping around the reins despite heavy gloves, Midnight's ears pricked forward. The horse whinnied, sharp and urgent. An answering whinny came from somewhere ahead, thin and desperate. Thad spurred forward and nearly rode past the rock outcropping without seeing it. A natural shelter, barely more than an overhang, but enough to break the worst of the wind. And huddled beneath it, wrapped in blankets and pressed against 2 horses for warmth, were 2 human shapes. Tobias was conscious, but barely, his lips blue with cold, his movements sluggish. And wrapped in his coat, pressed against the younger man's chest for warmth, was Nate. The boy's eyes were closed. His face was white as the snow around them. Thad was off Midnight before the horse had fully stopped, dropping to his knees beside the child. His fingers, clumsy with cold, found the pulse point at Nate's throat. There, faint but steady. Thank God. "Got lost," Tobias managed through chattering teeth. "Tried to get back. Couldn't see. Found this place. Been here, don't know, hours." Finn was already pulling blankets from his saddlebag. "We can't make it back to the ranch in this. We'll have to wait it out here." Thad looked at the sky. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Night was coming fast, bringing temperatures that would drop even lower. And they were going to have to survive until morning in this barely adequate shelter, miles from help, with a child who might already be hypothermic. He pulled Nate close, wrapping the boy in his own coat, sharing his body heat. The child stirred slightly, whimpered. "I've got you," Thad whispered against Nate's dark hair. "I've got you, son. You're safe now." The words slipped out without thought. Son. Not boy or child or Nate. Son. And in that moment, crouched in a snow cave while wind tried to tear the world apart, Thad understood something he'd been too careful to admit for 4 weeks. He didn't just care about Maggie Brennan. He loved her. Loved her children as if they were his own. This boy who might die in his arms. The little girl back at the ranch who called chickens by royal names. And the baby not yet born that Maggie carried beneath her heart. 5 years he'd watched her from afar. 5 years of telling himself it was enough just to see her, to know she existed in the world. But it wasn't enough. It had never been enough. If they survived this night, if Nate survived, if Maggie and the baby were safe when he got back, he was going to tell her everything. Going to lay his heart bare and ask for something he had no right to ask for. Her children. All of them. A chance to be a family instead of an employer and employee dancing around feelings they were both too afraid to name. The storm raged on through the endless night. Back at the ranch, Maggie paced the cottage like a caged animal, one hand pressed to her lower back where the pain was getting worse. Abby was asleep, exhausted from crying for her brother. Doc Harrison sat at the table, drinking coffee and trying to project a calm he clearly didn't feel. "They'll find shelter," he said for the 10th time. "Thad knows this country. He won't take unnecessary risks." But Maggie barely heard him. Her mind was spinning with images of Nate frozen in the snow, of Thad lost in the storm trying to save him, of everything she'd fought so hard to protect, being ripped away by wind and cold and fate. The pain started just after midnight, a cramping in her lower back that she'd been trying to ignore for hours, a tightening in her belly that couldn't be what she thought it was, not now. Not at barely 7 months. The baby wasn't due for another 6 weeks, at least. "Mrs. Brennan?" Doc Harrison's voice seemed to come from far away. "Are you all right? You've gone pale." The next contraction hit like a fist to the gut. Maggie gasped, doubling over, her hand clutching the table for support. "No," she whispered. "No, it's too early. The baby's not due until February." Doc Harrison was on his feet immediately, his weathered face grim. "How far along are you, really?" 7 months, almost exactly." Another contraction, stronger this time, stealing her breath. "My husband died in May. I conceived in March. The baby shouldn't come until late January at the earliest." Her water broke. A gush of warm fluid that soaked through her dress and made the reality of what was happening impossible to deny. The baby was coming. 2 months early, in the middle of a blizzard, with the only doctor in 50 miles cut off from his medical supplies in town and no way to get help. "I need you to lie down," Doc Harrison said, his voice steady despite the panic in his eyes. "Now, Mrs. Brennan, we need to get you to bed." But Maggie couldn't move. The contractions were coming fast now, too fast, the way they did when a body knew something was wrong and wanted it over with quickly. Her legs wouldn't hold her. She sank to the floor right there in the kitchen, and the doctor had to catch her before she fell completely. Doc Harrison shouted for help. Within minutes, Finn's wife, Martha, appeared from the bunkhouse where she'd been waiting out the storm with the other families. She was a sturdy woman of 45 who'd birthed 6 children of her own and helped deliver a dozen more. Together, they got Maggie to her bed. Abby woke crying, frightened by her mother's screams. Martha sent her to the main house with Jasper's wife, away from what was about to happen. The labor was brutal, fast and hard, and wrong in every way that mattered. 7-month babies were fragile, often didn't survive, and in a storm, miles from proper medical care, with limited supplies, the chances dropped even lower. Maggie screamed through contractions that felt like her body was tearing itself apart. She called for Nate, lost in the storm, called for Thad, who might already be dead, trying to save her son, called for a God who seemed to have forgotten she existed. Doc Harrison worked with grim efficiency, barking orders at Martha, doing everything he could with what little he had. Just before dawn, as the storm finally began to ease, the baby came. A boy, tiny, silent. For one terrible moment, Maggie thought he was dead. Then Doc Harrison cleared the infant's throat, and a weak, mewling cry filled the room. "He's alive," the doctor said, his voice rough with relief and worry in equal measure. "But he's small, very small. Maybe 4 pounds, if that. We need to keep him warm, keep him fed if he'll take milk." They wrapped the baby in every blanket they could find. He was so small he fit in Maggie's 2 hands, his skin almost translucent, his cry barely louder than a kitten's mew. But he was breathing, fighting, alive. Maggie held him against her chest and wept. For her son lost in the storm, for this new son fighting for every breath, for everything she stood to lose, and everything she'd somehow, impossibly, been given. The sun rose on a world transformed by snow. 3 feet had fallen overnight, drifting in places to 6 or 8 feet. The ranch was buried in white, beautiful and deadly. Finn was the first to spot riders coming down from the north pasture. 5 horses moving slowly through the deep snow. 5 riders hunched against the cold. All of them alive. Maggie heard the shouts from her bed where she lay exhausted, the tiny baby still pressed against her chest. Heard Martha cry out that the men were back. Heard Finn's voice raised in thanks to a God he usually kept at arm's length. She tried to get up, but Doc Harrison pushed her back down. "You just gave birth 3 hours ago. You're not going anywhere." But then the cottage door burst open, and Thad was there, snow crusted in his hair and beard, his face burned red by the wind, his eyes wild with worry. "Nate's at the main house," he said without preamble. "Doc needs to check him, but I think he's all right. Cold and scared, but—" He stopped, seeing Maggie in bed, seeing the tiny bundle against her chest, seeing the exhaustion and tears on her face. "What happened?" "I had the baby." Her voice was hoarse from screaming. "Early. Too early. But he's alive. He's fighting." Thad crossed the room in 3 long strides. He knelt beside the bed, his cold hands gentle as he touched the infant's tiny head, barely larger than his palm. "A boy?" "Yes. He's so small. 7 months. The stress of the storm, of thinking Nate was lost." Maggie's voice broke. "I couldn't stop it. I tried, but I couldn't." "Hush." Thad's hand covered hers where it cradled the baby. "You have nothing to apologize for." His gray eyes met hers, and in them Maggie saw everything he'd been hiding for 5 years. All the love, all the longing, all the careful distance he'd maintained because he'd thought it was the honorable thing to do. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly, his voice still rough from shouting through the storm. "And I need to say it now, before I lose my courage. Thad, I love you." The words came out raw and honest. "I've loved you for 5 years, since the day I tasted your Irish stew and saw past the judgment everyone else heaped on you to the woman you really are, strong and kind and brave in ways I've never been." Maggie's breath caught. "Last night, in that storm, holding your boy and not knowing if we'd make it through, all I could think about was that I'd wasted 5 years. 5 years of watching you from a distance when I could have been beside you. 5 years of pretending what I felt was admiration when it was love. Pure, simple, terrifying love." He looked down at the tiny baby, then back at her face. "I know this isn't proper. I know I'm your employer, and you're vulnerable, and you just gave birth, and the whole town will say I'm taking advantage. But I don't care anymore. I'm tired of being proper, tired of being alone, tired of pretending I don't want what I want." "What do you want?" Maggie whispered. "You, your children, all of them." His hand tightened on hers. "Marry me, right now, today, before the custody hearing, before Victoria can take Nate and Abby from you. Marry me and make them legally mine. Make this baby mine. Make yourself mine if you'll have me." "Thad, you don't have to." "I want to." His voice was fierce. "God help me, I've wanted to for 5 years. I want to wake up to your cooking every morning. Want to teach Nate to run a ranch. Want to watch Abby grow up. Want to be a father to this baby boy who came too early and is already fighting so hard to live." He swallowed hard, his eyes bright. "I want to be your husband, Maggie. Not your employer, not your protector. Your husband, your partner. The man who stands beside you for whatever time God gives us. If you'll have me." In the doorway, Doc Harrison and Martha exchanged glances. This was private. They should leave. But they stayed, because some moments were too important to interrupt. Maggie looked at this man, who'd given her his savings without hesitation, who'd ridden into a killing storm to save her son, who'd knelt beside her bed with snow still melting in his hair, and offered her everything he had. She thought about the girl she'd been 20 years ago, full of dreams about what marriage should be. The woman she'd become, ground down by a husband who drank and a town that judged. The mother she was now, fighting for her children's future with everything she had. And she thought about the chance for something different, something real. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Thad's eyes closed. His shoulders shook with something that might have been a sob or a laugh, or both. "Thank God," he breathed. "Thank God." He kissed her then, gently, mindful of her exhaustion and the baby between them. It was a kiss of promise and hope, and 5 years of patient longing finally finding its home. When they pulled apart, Martha was crying openly, and Doc Harrison was smiling like he'd just witnessed something close to a miracle. "I'll fetch Father Walsh," the doctor said. "Storm or no storm, I expect he'll want to officiate this wedding himself." Father Walsh arrived 2 hours later, having ridden through snowdrifts that came up to his horse's chest. He took one look at Maggie in bed, at the premature infant in her arms barely clinging to life, at Thad standing beside her like a man defending a fortress, and he smiled. "Well," the old priest said in his thick Irish brogue, "I've married couples in stranger circumstances, but this might be the most important wedding I've ever performed." Nate and Abby were brought in, both children subdued and frightened but unharmed. Nate's eyes went wide when he saw the baby. "Mama? When did—" "Last night, sweetheart, while you were lost in the storm. This is your new brother." "He's so tiny." Nate's voice was small, scared. "Is he going to be okay?" "We're going to do everything we can to make sure he is. And we're all going to need to be strong for him." Maggie reached for Nate's hand with her free one. "And we're all going to need to be strong together. Because Mr. Garrett and I are getting married. Right now. Today." Abby clapped her small hands together, her fear momentarily forgotten. "Like in the stories? A real wedding?" "A real wedding, baby girl." The ceremony was simple. Maggie, in her nightgown, still weak from labor, the baby cradled against her chest. Thad, in clothes still damp from melted snow, his face weathered and scarred by the storm. Nate and Abby standing on one side, solemn as little judges. Doc Harrison and Martha as witnesses. Finn and several of the ranch hands crowding into the small cottage to bear witness. Father Walsh read the familiar words, and they'd never sounded more sacred. "Do you, Thaddeus Michael Garrett, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." Thad's voice was steady as stone. "And do you, Margaret Catherine Brennan, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." Maggie's voice was hoarse but certain. "Then by the power vested in me by God and the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you husband and wife." Father Walsh's weathered face creased in a smile. "Thad, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, almost chaste. But Maggie felt its promise all the way to her bones. "There's one more thing," Thad said after, pulling papers from his coat pocket. They were slightly damp from snow, but still legal. "Adoption papers, for Nathaniel and Abigail, making them legally mine, if their mother consents." Maggie's eyes filled with tears. "I consent." Father Walsh witnessed the signatures, made it official, legal, final. The children who'd been fathered by a drunk and raised by a struggling widow were now, in the eyes of the law and God, the children of Thaddeus Garrett, heirs to the Diamond G Ranch, protected by a man who'd proven he'd ride into blizzards for them. "And the baby?" Father Walsh asked gently, looking at the tiny infant who'd been born fighting against impossible odds. "Patrick," Maggie said, the name coming to her in that moment. "After you, Father." "And Samuel, after Thad's middle name." "Patrick Samuel Garrett." The old priest's eyes went bright with tears. "You honor me, child, and I'll baptize the wee lad right now, if you'll allow it." Just in case, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They all knew how fragile this tiny life was. The baptism was quick. Holy water from the bottle Father Walsh always carried. Words spoken in Latin and English both. A prayer for life and strength and the grace of God to sustain them all. When it was done, Father Walsh laid his weathered hand on the baby's tiny head. "Live, Patrick Samuel Garrett. Live and grow strong. Your family needs you." After everyone had left, Thad sat carefully on the edge of the bed. He'd cleaned up, shaved, changed into fresh clothes. But his eyes were still red-rimmed with exhaustion, his movements slow. "You should rest," Maggie said softly. "I will. But first—" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "This was my mother's, the only thing I have of hers. I want you to wear it, if you will." Maggie held out her left hand. The ring slid on perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years for her finger. "It's beautiful." "You're beautiful." Thad's voice was rough with emotion. And I know this isn't the wedding night you deserve. You need to heal. The baby needs to grow stronger. But I want you to know that when you're ready, when the time is right, I'll do everything in my power to make you happy." "You already have." Maggie caught his hand, pressed it to her cheek. "You saved Nate, married me when I had nothing to offer you but trouble, made my children yours without hesitation. That's more happiness than I thought I'd ever know again." "You offered me everything," Thad corrected gently. "You offered me a reason to stop being half alive, a purpose beyond just surviving, a family." He bent and kissed her forehead, tender as a prayer. Then he settled into the chair beside the bed, refusing to leave despite his exhaustion, and kept watch over his new wife and newborn son while they slept. Outside, the storm had passed. The sun broke through the clouds, turning the snow-covered ranch into a landscape of diamonds. And for the first time in 5 years, the Diamond G felt less like a monument to the dead and more like a home for the living. The custody hearing was scheduled for December 15th at 9 o'clock in the morning. But when Victoria Ashford swept into the territorial courthouse, expecting an easy victory, she found Maggie sitting beside Thaddeus Garrett, wearing a gold wedding band and nursing an infant who'd been born 6 days earlier. The look on Victoria's face was worth every moment of pain and uncertainty Maggie had endured. Judge Thaddeus Blackwood was a man of 60, honest despite his friendship with Victoria, and bound by law above all else. He looked at the marriage certificate dated December 11th, at the adoption papers filed and witnessed, at the week-old baby, small enough to fit in one of Maggie's hands. "Mrs. Ashford," he said slowly, "it appears the grounds for your petition have changed significantly." Victoria's face was tight with fury, 2 spots of red burning high on her cheeks. "The marriage is clearly a sham, a desperate attempt to avoid the consequences of immoral behavior." "The marriage is legal," Thad said quietly, his arm around Maggie's shoulders in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "Performed by Father Walsh, witnessed by 6 people, filed with the territorial clerk. My wife and I are raising our children in a stable, loving home." Children conceived in sin, a child conceived in marriage to her first husband. Doc Harrison stood up from where he'd been sitting in the back of the courtroom. "I have medical records proving Mrs. Garrett," he emphasized the new name deliberately, "was approximately 7 months pregnant when her husband died in May. Young Patrick here came early at 7 months gestation due to the stress of a blizzard and worrying about her son lost in the storm. But he was conceived in lawful wedlock to her late husband, Thomas Brennan." Victoria turned on him, her voice rising. "You're lying to protect her." "I'm a doctor. I don't lie about medical facts, and I'll swear to it under oath if necessary." Doc Harrison's voice was steel. "Furthermore, I delivered this baby myself 6 days ago during the worst storm we've seen in a decade. He weighed barely 4 pounds. He's lucky to be alive. And his mother is lucky to be alive after what she went through." Finn stood next. "I've worked for Mr. Garrett for 15 years. Never seen him happier than he's been these past weeks. Mrs. Garrett runs his household with integrity and grace. The children are well cared for, well fed, and loved. This is a real family, not some scheme to avoid legal consequences." One by one, the ranch hands stood. Caleb, Silas, Ezra, Jasper, all testifying to Maggie's character, to the quality of her care, to the reality of her marriage. But it was Rosalind Ashford who delivered the killing blow. She stood up from beside her mother, her face pale but determined, her hands clenched at her sides. "Your Honor, I need to speak." Victoria grabbed her daughter's arm hard enough to leave marks. "Rosalind, sit down." "No, Mother." Rosalind pulled free, not gently this time. "I'm done being silent. I'm done being complicit in your cruelty." She turned to face the judge, her voice shaking but clear. "My mother isn't concerned about the welfare of these children. She's angry because Mr. Garrett chose Mrs. Garrett instead of me. She's been pushing us together for 5 years, trying to arrange a marriage that neither of us wanted. When he married someone else, when he chose a woman my mother had spent years tormenting, she decided to punish them both, using the law as her weapon." Victoria's face went white, then purple with rage. "You ungrateful?" "I'm not ungrateful. I'm honest." Rosalind's voice grew stronger. "Mrs. Garrett is a good mother. Her children are clean, well-fed, warm, and loved. They live on one of the finest ranches in the territory, with a man who rode into a blizzard that nearly killed him to save them. What more could any child possibly need?" Judge Blackwood looked at Victoria with something close to disgust. "Mrs. Ashford, I'm dismissing this petition with prejudice. The children are in a stable home with their legally married parents. Not only is there no evidence of abuse or neglect, there's ample evidence of a loving family. This case never should have been brought before this court. This is a travesty of justice." "No, Victoria." The judge's voice was cold. "What you attempted here is the travesty. Using the law to settle personal grudges, attempting to tear children from their mother out of spite. I'm appalled that you would stoop to such depths." His gavel came down hard. "Case dismissed. Mr. and Mrs. Garrett, you and your children are free to go. And Mrs. Ashford, if you ever bring such frivolous charges before my court again, I'll hold you in contempt." Thad stood, offering his hand to Maggie. She took it, cradling tiny Patrick against her chest with her other arm. The baby was still frighteningly small, still fighting for every breath, but he was growing stronger each day. Nate and Abby pressed close to their mother's sides, their small faces bright with relief. As they left the courthouse, Victoria's voice followed them, shrill with impotent rage. But it didn't matter anymore. The words had no power, no teeth. They were a family, legal, protected, whole. On the courthouse steps, Thad turned to address the crowd that had gathered. His voice carried across Sweetwater's main street, strong and clear. "My wife is the finest woman this town has ever seen. She's brave and kind and honest in ways most of you will never understand. She's survived things that would have broken lesser people, and any man would be honored to stand beside her. I count myself blessed beyond measure that she chose to stand beside me." He paused, his eyes sweeping the gathered crowd. "Anyone who has a problem with my wife has a problem with me, and I suggest you think carefully about whether that's a problem you want to have." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Finn started clapping. Slowly at first, then louder. Doc Harrison joined in, then Ruth, who'd been standing in the crowd with tears streaming down her face. One by one, people began to applaud. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to matter. Spring came to Wyoming Territory in 1886, with wildflowers blooming across the high country, and new calves born to the Diamond G herd. The ranch prospered under Thad's management and Maggie's care, the combination of his business sense and her domestic skill creating something greater than either could have achieved alone. Patrick Samuel Garrett grew stronger with each passing week. By March, he'd reached a healthy weight. By April, he was smiling. By June, He was a fat, happy baby who bore no sign of his difficult entry into the world except for being slightly smaller than other babies his age. Maggie's bakery operated out of a room Thad had converted in one of the outbuildings. She baked bread and pies that ranch hands sold in town, bringing in money that was hers alone, though Thad had made it clear she never needed to work for money again. But it mattered to her to have something that was her own, and he understood that. Nate, at 9, was becoming a fine horseman under Finn's tutelage. Thad was teaching him the ranch business, showing him how to read cattle, how to manage grazing land, how to be fair with the men who worked for you. Abby, at 6, had learned to bake from her mother and could make biscuits that rivaled Maggie's own. She also had a gift for drawing, and Thad encouraged it by ordering paper and pencils from Denver. The family thrived in ways that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. And on a warm June evening, as Maggie was preparing supper, she felt the familiar flutter in her belly, the quickening, the first movements of new life. She was pregnant again, this time truly and completely with Thad's child. When she told him that night, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. Joy, wonder, a fierce protectiveness that made her feel safer than she'd ever felt in her life. "Another baby," he whispered, his hand pressed gently to her still flat stomach. "Ours." "Ours," she agreed. "Due in February of 1887, I think. Almost exactly a year after we married." They sat together on the porch of the main house, their house now, filled with the sound of children's laughter and the smell of bread baking, and watched the sun set over the mountains. "5 years ago," Thad said quietly, "I tasted your stew and thought it was the closest I'd ever come to magic. And now? Now I know that the real magic was you, not the food. You. The woman who turned a house into a home, who made a lonely rancher remember what it felt like to be alive, who gave me a family when I thought that chapter of my life was over." Maggie leaned into him, breathing in the scent of leather and sun-warmed cotton and home. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving it." In May of 1888, nearly 3 years after that desperate November when Maggie had faced eviction, the Diamond G Ranch had expanded even further. 900 cattle now, 60 horses, 12 ranch hands, and 6 people living in the main house that Thad had expanded to accommodate their growing family. Nate, at 11, was taking on real responsibility. He had his own string of horses to manage and was learning bookkeeping from his stepfather, though he never called Thad anything but Pa anymore. Abby, at 8, had started a small business selling her drawings to townspeople. She was also becoming an excellent cook under Maggie's patient instruction. Patrick, at 3 years and 4 months, was a whirlwind of energy and joy. He'd grown into a healthy, sturdy boy who followed his older brother everywhere, chattering constantly in the way of small children. And Margaret Rose Garrett, called Maggie Rose to distinguish her from her mother, was 15 months old now. Born in February of 1887, during the mildest winter Wyoming had seen in years. Delivered safely by Doc Harrison, with Thad holding Maggie's hand through every contraction. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's auburn hair, and she was absolutely adored by everyone on the ranch. On a Sunday afternoon in May, the whole family gathered for the church picnic. It was held in the same spot where, 6 years earlier, Thad had first tasted Maggie's Irish stew and felt his world shift beneath his feet. This year, Maggie had made the same recipe, but now she served it with her husband at her side, her children playing nearby, and the respect of a community that had finally learned to see past its own prejudices. Victoria Ashford was there, diminished now. Her power had crumbled after the failed custody case. People had started seeing her cruelty for what it was, and one by one, they'd distanced themselves. She sat alone on a bench, avoided by the very society she'd once ruled. Maggie felt no triumph in that, only sadness for a woman who'd let pride destroy everything she'd built. Rosalind, by contrast, had flourished. She'd moved to Denver and opened a successful dress shop. She visited Sweetwater occasionally and always stopped at the Diamond G to see the children and share news from the city. She and Maggie had developed a friendship based on mutual respect and the understanding that both had survived Victoria's particular brand of cruelty. As the sun began to set, Thad found Maggie sitting beneath a cottonwood tree, baby Maggie Rose asleep in her arms, watching their children play tag in the fading light. He sat beside her, his shoulder warm against hers. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly. "That 6 years ago, you sat at a table and tasted my stew. And somehow, that one moment led to all of this." She gestured at their children playing, at the life they'd built together. How does that happen? How does something so small become something so enormous? "I don't know," Thad admitted, "but I'm grateful for it. For you. For every moment since that day, even the hard ones. Even the custody battle? Even the blizzard that almost killed you? Especially those. They taught us what we were capable of, taught us that love isn't just the easy moments. It's riding into storms and fighting legal battles and choosing each other every single day, even when it's difficult." Maggie leaned into him, feeling the solid strength of his body against hers, the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," she said. "I don't think I ever properly said it before. Not the way I should. But I love you, completely, with everything I am." "I know." Thad kissed the top of her head gently. "I've known since that first night when you served me Cole Cannon and looked at me like I was more than just the man who'd given you a job. You've been showing me with every meal you cook, every time you smile at our children, every morning you wake up beside me. But it's good to hear the words, too." As darkness fell over the Wyoming prairie, the Garrett family loaded into their wagon for the ride home. Nate sat up front with his father, learning to drive. Abby held Patrick on her lap, telling him stories to keep him entertained. And Maggie cradled baby Maggie Rose, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. They rode toward the Diamond G, toward home, toward a future built on hard work and honest love, and the simple truth that sometimes the people who seem invisible are the ones worth seeing most clearly. Behind them, Sweetwater's lights began to glow in the darkness. But ahead, the ranch waited, warm, safe, theirs. And Maggie understood, finally and completely, what her mother had meant all those years ago. The secret ingredient wasn't just love. It was believing you deserved love in the first place, that you were worthy of being seen, that your existence wasn't something to apologize for, but something to celebrate. She'd learned that lesson the hard way, through poverty and judgment, and a blizzard that nearly took everything from her, through labor that came too early, and a baby who fought to live, and a man who'd loved her when she couldn't see herself as worthy of love. But she'd learned it, and now she'd pass it on to her children, all 5 of them, bound by love, if not always by blood, so they'd never have to fight as hard as she had to understand their own worth. The wagon rolled on through the spring night, carrying a family built not just by birth, but by choice and courage and love, that had waited 5 years to finally come home. Above them, stars burned cold and bright across the Wyoming sky. And somewhere in that vast darkness,
Maggie felt her mother's presence, felt her approval.
Felt the completion of a circle that had begun in County Galway generations ago and had finally, against all odds, found its ending in redemption and grace. "Thank you," she whispered to the night, to God, to Thad, to everyone who'd helped her survive long enough to find this moment. And the night whispered back in the voices of her children, in the warmth of her husband's hand, in the steady rhythm of horses' hooves carrying them home. "You're welcome. You're worthy. You're loved. You always were."